we're going to talk about what I'm going to call the genuine moral action application of our just holiness expectations. It occurred to me, I guess over the period of several years, that there were three conditions that needed to be met in order to assess the moral evaluation of any particular act or probably even any particular policy. So I began by calling these by different names. I gave it technical philosophical names at first, and then I thought, well, most people are not aware of technical philosophical terminology, so I maybe ought to change this. So what we have done is we have taken the three conditions that establish what agape is. You go back to what Jesus said when he was asked, what's the great commandment in the law? And he responds with Deuteronomy 6:5. You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then he says the second one is like it. And then he goes to Leviticus 19:18, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And then it occurs to me when Jesus quotes that one, he supplements it in the Sermon on the Mount by saying that you shall love your neighbor as yourself, even if your neighbor is an enemy. So there seem to be three components here. One is the effects condition. And I think we've talked about this. Every action anybody undertakes alters the configuration of the world at large. Otherwise, it wouldn't be an action. So it has an effect. Everyone has an effect. And you have to consider that the effect results in either an enhancement of human well-being or in a diminishment of human well-being. It either enhances well-being, human thriving, or it diminishes human well-being, causing misery. So we're going to talk about the effects condition. And there are two dimensions of the effects condition, and I kind of mentioned them there. In the agape effects condition requires a maxim which says that you have a moral duty to act in such a way that you maximize human well-being. And one of the ways I think we can gain some clarity about that is to apply the golden rule. Whatsoever you would that men should do unto you, do ye even so unto them. I think you can add something to that without distorting it very much. Whatsoever you would that men should do unto you, do ye even so unto them, whether they do it to you or not. So it universalizes this sort of exposure. The other thing about that is if you interpret it in a slightly different way, you end up by saying, if you know what it is to be treated unfairly or unjustly or immorally, then you know enough to know that it's going to be unjust to somebody else. So it isn't a fact that you don't know because you can apply it in your own case. So that becomes the effects condition. We go on to the next condition, which we call the neighbor condition. Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. Well, you always have the question, who's my neighbor? Jesus defines the neighbor as any other human being. And if that's the case, then how do you treat other human beings? Well, there are three maxims that apply. The first maxim is what we would call the dignity maxim, that every person has the moral duty to treat every other person, enemy or not, with dignity and respect. The next condition is what we call the advocacy condition, the advocacy maxim. And it requires that you have the moral duty to be an advocate for things that are true, right, and good. And it will take some effort to go into what each of those mean, and I'm not going to do that at the moment. The third maxim is the maxim of reconciliation. When we are harmed, we are tempted to retaliate. We must resist that temptation. Gandhi got it right, I think. An eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. He responded in South Africa to a person who said, we need to kill a few officials and then the government will pay attention to us. And the person also said, I am prepared to die for killing officials. And Gandhi's response was classic. I too am willing to die for this cause, but there is no cause for which I am willing to kill. That turn of phrase, that use of the language was just precise. There is no cause for which I am ready to kill. So we strive for the reconciliation of all people to each other and to God. So that meets the neighbor condition. The self condition is how do we regard ourselves as moral creatures? And there are just two conditions, two maxims with regard to that. One is that we have the moral duty to repudiate and eradicate all of the vices that we have acquired, what we have chosen to use to define ourselves. We have configured ourselves with some formula, some configuration of vices. Vices will always cause dysfunction, conflict, turmoil. So we have to not only repudiate that, but we have to eradicate that. The flip side of that is that the virtue acquisition maxim. So we have the virtue or the vice repudiation maxim. Now we have the virtue acquisition maxim, and that is you have a moral duty to acquire all of the virtues you have not already acquired. So we have these three conditions, and so if we start to envision this as three circles, and the three circles would indicate that the effects condition, the set of things that meet as effects condition, the neighbor condition, and the self condition. Now we overlap those. Many of you may be familiar with the Venn diagram. And the Venn diagram establishes things as sets of things that exclude certain other kinds of things. So if we overlap those things, then we get 8 spaces. And in logic, we call these logical spaces. There is the condition in the middle, which is the GMA. That is the condition in which the effects maxim are adhered to, where the neighbor maxims are adhered to, and where the self conditions are adhered to. When all three of those conditions are met, then we have a GMA. And GMA, just students don't really listen very carefully, so I want to say it very carefully. This is a genuinely moral action. An action which meets all three conditions is a genuinely moral action. Now, I think when I was taught about sin, that things were either sins or they weren't sins. There was sort of a binary way of looking at things, to use contemporary mathematical IT vocabulary. I think that there are probably more than that. So the question started to occur to me, not all actions are going to be GMA or not GMA. They're going to fail one of those conditions or other in certain kinds of environments. So what would we say if it met two conditions and failed a third condition? Well, then you would end up with something we're going to call nearly moral actions. Now, a nearly moral action is not a GMA. It is not a genuinely moral action. So it is deficient in one respect or other. There are three possible ways in which it could be deficient. It could be deficient with regard to self and neighbor. It could meet the self and neighbor condition, but fail the effects condition. The other possibility is that it can meet the effects and self condition and fail the neighbor condition. And the other one is that it can meet the effects and neighbor condition, but fail the self condition. So you could have an NMA, but you could have three different kinds of them. The other possibility now is, what if you only meet one of those conditions? And if you meet only one of those conditions, we're going to call this barely moral action. It has some moral feature to it because it meets one of the conditions, but it fails two of the conditions. So there are going to be three of those too. There are going to be three BMAs. There's the BMA which only meets the self condition. This would be a person who only cares about his personal virtue and does not care about the neighbor or the effect condition. The other one is a case where it meets the effect conditions, but it fails the neighbor and the self condition. Then you have a BMA. The other one is where you have it meets a neighbor condition, but it fails the effects condition and a self condition. Then those are three possible cases of barely moral actions. And that leaves us with the fourth possibility, and that is that there are actions or policies which don't meet any of those conditions. And those we're going to call GIA. They're genuinely immoral actions or social policies. Now, a couple of applications of this. One is anticipation, and the other one is evaluation. Let's say that I know I've got to make a decision about doing something or other, and I'm unsure about what action to take. So what I do is I take the action that is under deliberation, and I apply these principles and see if I can get an action which is GMA. So I need to get an action. I need to decide upon an action and undertake an action when that action is going to maximize the effects condition, the neighbor condition, and the self condition. And if I can do that, then I am under a moral obligation to undertake that action. Now, one of the considerations I am making is that I can't really quite get to a GMA. I ought to be able to say, why can't I get to a GMA? Where is the failure likely to occur? And can I fix my considerations so that it can get to a GMA? So maybe an action I am undertaking is maybe nearly moral, and it fails because it doesn't take its effect on my virtue into consideration. Then I need to probably try to figure out, okay, what is the moral? How does it affect me as a virtuous person if I undertake this action? And what would really be fun is if people bring scenarios into into a group and start talking about a scenario like that. I mean, I'm thinking of Tuskegee syphilis experiments from where they knew that people had syphilis, but they did not inform people that they had syphilis, and they did not treat the syphilis. Now, how would that fall out on this? Would it pass the effects? Would it maximize well-being? Would it minimize misery? Well, then it fails the effects condition. Well, treating my neighbor. Well, does it treat a person with syphilis with dignity and respect? Does it advocate for things that are true, right, and good? Does it advocate for the reconciliation of all people to God and to each other? Well, if it fails two conditions, then the best it can be is what? Barely moral. Okay. So we've covered the effects and we've covered then the neighbor. What's left?
So
The self, okay? If I were to undertake the experimentation on syphilis patients as a doctor or a lab technician or whatever, and I'm doing it because I've been instructed to do it, my pay is contingent on it, and so on, and I decided that, okay, I need the money, would that make me a virtuous person or a vice person? Yeah. So now under those conditions, I will have failed 3 of the conditions, which means that participating in the syphilis program would have been generally immoral. How about the guy who even conceived of that? Maybe the guy who filled out the grant to get the money to actually do that. Would the program have a positive public policy that would somehow mitigate against its genuinely immoral character? I sort of doubt it.